Okay, I think we'll just get started. If people join us over the next few minutes, then they can just catch up very quickly. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to join us this lunchtime for our webinar today, which is all about job quality during and after a pandemic. So I guess what we want to do today is we want to look at what has changed, what hasn't changed, and of course, what it all means for things like public policy, but also for HR practice. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Marek Zemanek. I'm the Senior Public Policy Advisor for the CIPD in Scotland. And here's a sort of rough agenda of what we want to cover today. I think the first thing I have to say is that we are recording this session for anybody who's decided to have a nice lunch rather than come and join us and wants to catch up a little bit later on. All of you as participants have been put on mute, but please don't let that stop you, and post any comments, observations, and of course any questions through the chat function, please. We have quite a big chunk of time at the end of today's session to do a bit of a Q&A with our panelists, so hopefully there's plenty of questions. If there's not, I might have to go and bore you with more stats and graphs, so I hope that's a strong enough incentive for you to ask as many questions as you can. In terms of what we will do today, first and foremost, for about 10 or 15 minutes, I will run through our Working Lives Scotland report, which is our sort of annual flagship report on job quality in Scotland, which we launched just yesterday, and go through some of the interesting findings in it, and perhaps have a little discussion on what they mean. This report is written around the Fair Work framework as conceptualized by the Fair Work Convention in Scotland, which is exactly why I'm delighted that Tricia Finlay, Professor Tricia Finlay, is joining us today, who, amongst many other things, is the co-chair of the Fair Work Convention. And Tricia will talk a little bit about what some of the findings mean for fair work, what the Fair Work Convention is up to. We recently entered a partnership with the Fair Work Convention and the CIPD in Scotland, so just to see what that means as well. On the practitioner side of things, I'm delighted to be joined by Francis Lake, who's the head of OD at Virgin Money, and I think Francis will talk a little bit about some of the practical things that Virgin Money has done throughout the pandemic, but also how it maybe informs some of the approaches post-pandemic as well. And then at the end, we should have about 20-25 minutes or so for a Q&A. So as I said, please ask as many questions as you have. Right, I'll just dive straight into Working Lives Scotland 2021. Now, as I said, this is our annual flagship job quality report, and it's the second time we've done this in Scotland. You may or may not know that the CIPD UK-wide produces what we call the Good Work Index, which is one of our biggest research reports that we do on a regular basis, based on a big YouGov survey of about 6,500 employees across the UK. And last year was the first time we decided to do a Scottish offshoot of that with a big boosted sample of over 1,000 employees, and it provided a really nice snapshot of job quality in Scotland. But we were of course excited to see how things would change year on year. Now, when we started working on it, we had absolutely no idea, of course, that we would be faced with one of the biggest disruptions to working practice in living memory. So I think we're really excited to get the data back and just to see what the impact has been of this turbulent year on the various dimensions of job quality. You know, everybody was concerned about things like well-being, especially mental well-being, employee voice, relationships at work, especially in the context of a large shift towards home working. So I think all of us who are working on the data and on the report are sort of waiting with bated breath to get the results back. And then the results came back, and nothing has changed, which was probably one of the biggest surprises that we got when we had the first look at the numbers. We saw that most of the indicators, and there have been some changes, of course, this is an oversimplification to say that nothing has changed, but all the indicators remained actually remarkably steady. And we see that job quality, both in a sort of good and a bad sense, is actually remarkably sticky. And we still see things like occupation and linked to that salary levels, for example, are still a key factor that determines job quality for employees. Of course, the first thing we had to do, we had to try and figure out why things haven't changed as much as we perhaps expected them to change. And there's probably a few reasons for it. I think one of the primary reasons is that, remember, this is an employee survey. So of course, the people whose job quality has changed the most during the pandemic, i.e. people who have lost their jobs, are no longer captured by the survey because it's just a survey of employees. Secondly, I think it's fair to say we are still in a bit of a holding pattern when it comes to the economy and the labor market. The scale of government intervention, the furlough scheme or any sort of range of government loans and grants, we still need to wait and see what the actual impact on employers and the workplace is going to be when these things are eventually withdrawn, probably later this year. The other thing to remember is that even though we've seen changes to where many employees work, big shifts to home working for those who can work from home, some of the underlying job design issues, job autonomy or job complexity issues, have not really changed. It actually makes sense that overall job quality would remain quite steady. But probably the most important and most interesting thing for an audience of CIPD members and HR practitioners primarily is that we are probably also seeing the impact of people management. We know employers and HR professionals invested quite a lot of effort in focusing on well-being, focusing on employee voice, for example, as well, alongside investment in technology, etc. And it's very likely that some of these interventions managed to mitigate the impact that many anticipated of the pandemic. Of course, the impact of the pandemic has not been equal for every employee, and that's why what we're doing in Working Life Scotland, in addition to analyzing the 5 fair work dimensions in their own right, what we're trying to do is we're trying to pull out interesting differences for various groups of employees as well. And I think it's those that I really wanted to focus on in the next sort of 5-10 minutes, because I think those are probably the most interesting findings there. And in particular, what I want to look at is home workers, key workers, and those who have been put on furlough. As I said in the beginning, I don't want to overwhelm you with graphs. There's only a few of them. The full report has plenty of those, plenty of statistics. You're very welcome to have a look at it. It's on our website and all our social channels as well. Let me just dive straight back in on the home working front. I think the first thing to say on home workers is that, of course, there's a big difference between home working as a chosen flexible work arrangement and home working as mandated by government. And I think we need to remember that as we go through some of these findings, but also as we think about what the future might look like. And I think it's fair to say that home working has not been a sort of universally positive experience, although in our data we do find there have been some positives, some of them perhaps even surprising. One of the things that we find is that home workers actually reported better relationships at work, especially relationships with their managers, compared with those who don't work from home at all. Similarly surprising to me, certainly anyway, was that home workers report better levels of employee voice. It's the communication with their employer, whether feedback is being taken on board, etc. And I think it's these two things that probably point to the fact that employers and people managers have really stepped up and put in place interventions that have helped. Now, as I said, it's not all just pros. On the negative side of things, perhaps a bit less surprising, we find home workers struggle with work-life balance more than those who can't work from home, and also are more likely to report excessive workloads. These things hold true even when we control for things like occupation, for example, and sort of the analysis that we do. So it really is the fact that you are working from home that has an impact on these two metrics. Of course, at the CIPD, we've been the last year or so quite frustrated to see home working being equated with flexible working full stop. And I think that's something that we will continually need to challenge. We know that 43% of our jobs cannot be done from home at all. And if you look at all the various flexible work arrangements that we ask about in the survey, we can see that yes, working from home has obviously increased due to the pandemic, but all the other ones are basically flatline, flexi time, compressed hours, etc. And I think if we do want to avoid these risks of creating almost like a two-tier workforce of those who can work from home and those who can't work from home, we need to think about flexibility a lot broader than just in home working terms. We also ask, of course, employees about how they would like to work after the pandemic, which is I think something that I'm sure Frances will mention as well. And for those who can work from home, the clear winner and the clear preference is to work from home some of the time. And that is true even for those who currently work from home full time. So people who currently work from home 5 days a week, their preference in the future would be to change that to some of the week. So any sort of, I think, statements about the death of the office are still quite premature. This is just one graph that I wanted to show you on the work-life balance front. 3 questions around work-life balance, and you will see that those fully working from home fare the worst in all of them, especially the last one here. I find it difficult to relax in my personal time because of my job. 37% of those fully working from home agree with that statement. And also noticeable, you see that those partly working from home seem to do the best actually on these metrics, and actually that's true for other job quality indicators there as well. And well, just as well, because as I said, future home working preferences of those who can seem to point to working from home some of the time. Okay, I'll move swiftly on to key workers. I think probably the thing that stands out the most for me is that we see quite a clear evidence of what I would call a rhetoric gap in terms of support for key workers. So very well clapping on the doorstep, but if we look at various metrics on job quality, key workers really fare worse, sometimes significantly worse than non-key workers. And if we want to address that, governments and employers will need to step up. On the most straightforward metric of pay, on objective pay, there's about a 10,000 pounds annual pay difference between key workers and non-key workers. Of course, key workers spans a broad range of industries and occupations, but if we generalize it like this, the difference is quite stark. And almost just as important, I would say, subjective pay, that is whether you feel you are getting paid appropriately for your job. 41% of key workers feel they are not. As I said, generally key workers will report poorer job quality, higher workloads compared to non-key workers, more likely to say they're exhausted and under excessive pressure, more likely to report presenteeism. That means going to work when you are not feeling well enough to do so. And also poorer on issues like job autonomy. So that's how much control you have over your work. There is one key exception, and this will probably not come as a surprise, and that's in relation to meaningful work. One of the questions we ask about is whether you have the feeling of doing useful work for society. 73% of key workers say that they feel that. Now, the last group of employees I want to look at very briefly is those on furlough. And I think 15 months ago, I had never even heard the word furlough. I don't think that's just because I'm foreign, but it's sort of suddenly become part of everyday discourse and vernacular, which is quite an interesting, I think, case study in how these things can happen. Now, the sample in Working Life Scotland is quite small, but we can still draw some conclusions, especially if we consider the findings of the UK-wide Good Work Index. there. And I think it's fair to say the job retention scheme is probably the most important intervention when it comes to preventing a sort of collapse of the labor market. I think we'll be doing a bit more work on whether there is a case for a permanent scheme there or not, the style that Germany has. I think that's an interesting question for on the sort of public policy front. In general, we do find that furloughed workers report slightly poorer job quality, especially on things like health and well-being, mental health. See 26% of those on furlough reported suffering from depression in the last year. Also challenges on job autonomy and complexity. The most significant difference between furloughed workers and those who have not been furloughed is, shouldn't come as a surprise, around job security. And the proportion of employees who say they are likely to lose their job in the next 12 months is almost 3 times higher for those on furlough compared with those who have not been put on furlough. The one thing that I did want to highlight, which is the thing that sort of struck me the most, I think, in these numbers, there's a big discussion, maybe a year ago when the scheme was announced, about what employees on furlough are allowed to do. Can they go and do some volunteering? Can they develop their skills? And us at the CIPD made a strong case for trying to use this time off work, when it's still being subsidized by government, to try and upskill or maybe even retrain, come up with some sort of way of engaging individuals who are on furlough and use that time constructively. So we asked employees who have been furloughed what they did whilst they were on furlough, and the percentage of furloughed employees who undertook any sort of training during time on furlough is 8%. Now that to me is a huge missed opportunity for public policy in particular, and it's probably something we should think about quite strongly if we are thinking about designing a sort of permanent scheme at some point in the future. And this is the last graph which I wanted to show, especially the one on the right in terms of the job security, which I just mentioned. The difference there is absolutely massive. Okay, just to wrap this up very quickly. As I said, we're still very much in a holding pattern. We wait and see what happens as government support unwinds, to see what happens to the labor market. Will it recover quickly? How do the changes to immigration policy, for example, tie into all this, and any sort of considerations on the future of the workplace there as well. Of course, the data shows that the challenges that we've identified and have been identifying for many years in the past are still there. We still have challenges around overqualification and mismatched skills, challenges around well-being, presenteeism, and you still have about 25%, 26% employees saying that their work impacts negatively on their mental health or on their physical health as well. And that's a really big chunk of employees. And there's still big challenges for employees with caring responsibilities, employees with disabilities, but there's big differences by gender as well, especially in things like flexible work availability. And as I said, there's also new challenges that have been brought about by COVID. I mentioned the dangers of a two-tier workforce and the importance to think about flexibility a bit broader. And then some of the things around relationships at work, employee voice and well-being, etc. as well. And then fundamentally, job design. I mean, job design is something that tends to be very sticky, but it is, surely this is an opportunity to try and think about it a bit more, see if things like job autonomy based on employee trust can change a little bit, especially given the experience over the last 15 months. And I think it's this experience of the last 15 months that we hope can be used to learn and to adapt approaches in businesses and ultimately improve job quality for all employees. Okay, thank you. And that is it from me. As I said, there's a lot more insight, a lot more data in the report, which is available online or obviously on social media channels there as well. So please do have a look, and any feedback, just let us know. I'll stop sharing my screen now as well. We'll send out the presentation afterwards if that's of interest. But I'll move on to Trisha. Now, Trisha, as I said, is the co-chair of the Fair Work Convention, and I'll just invite her to say a few words about the convention's work and what next for Fair Work in Scotland. Thank you, Trisha.
Thank you, Marek. Thank you for the invitation to come along to the event today, and also to have had the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of the convention in the foreword to the report. It's no exaggeration, I think, to say that the pandemic has been a testing time for the pursuit of fair work in Scotland, and having new data to understand developments in fair work and what it looks like at this very distinctive time is immensely helpful to us. Of course, people may know something about the convention, and as a convention and in the Fair Work framework, which underpins all of the convention's work, we've really long stressed the importance of good job quality, good people in HR practice, and particularly attention to effective voice and dialogue as being really good things for individuals, but also practices that produce very positive outcomes for employers. And our prior evidence and understanding of that relationship between fair work, individual outcomes and organisational outcomes has been very strong and robust. But if our collective experience over the last 15 months has shown us anything at all, it has shown us that fair work and good people practice only grow in importance during a crisis, they don't diminish. So from the convention's point of view, kind of making a few comments around the experience of COVID, putting people's well-being at the very heart of the COVID response has been really crucial for us, and making sure that that commitment to fair work, even in the most challenging circumstances, remains a priority. And I think in doing that as a convention over the last year, we've been joined in our efforts by many stakeholders here in Scotland, including CIPD, and indeed including the Scottish Government. So our current concerns as a convention is to make sure that any existing commitment to fair work doesn't diminish over the recovery to come. And indeed, maybe more importantly than that, to basically stress that our attention to fair work can drive a recovery that produces a much better new normal. And I'll come back to say something about that in a minute or so. We know, of course, and this audience knows well, that fair work has been long an agenda close to the hearts and really central to the practice of many HR professionals. I'm sure nobody on this event or this round their computers at the moment are naive in their understanding that the professional HR community doesn't always get to deliver what it might want to in this regard. But I think it's undoubtedly the case that the pandemic has thrust HR professionals into the eye of the storm. And maybe this is a good opportunity to collectively thank the many HR professionals for what they've done over that period, for the long hours that they've put in, for the increased demands that they've faced, for the writing of new policies at warp speed, for their requirement to be flexible and responsive, and for all the contributions that they've made to keep things going. And most importantly, for the continuing attention that we've seen in organisations across HR professionals and indeed by CIPD to putting wellbeing centre stage and to supporting staff during this time. I think HR professionals now are centre stage in the pandemic response, and I really hope that the profession emerges from this quite difficult period with something of a renewed confidence about the contribution that they've made, and with greater recognition of the importance of their role. And from a convention point of view, we've always accepted that HR professionals are a group of key influencers when it comes to whether or not fair work is or isn't delivered. And that's really why our first formal strategic partnership as a convention has been with CIPD. And we hope that that partnership will give us something in which we can build lots of cross-learning and much greater engagement with the HR profession in the months and years to come. Turning to make a few comments, I suppose, specifically on the report, I think there are some really interesting insights in the report that Marek's just presented a short snapshot of. And if I could maybe just highlight 3 positive things and 3 more concerning things, some of which I suppose overlap with some of the data that Marek has just shown you. The first positive thing I think I would stress is that high quality people management and high quality voice and dialogue have undoubtedly supported employers and employees across a wide range of workplaces and sectors to make an effective response to the pandemic. And we can see that in this report. We can see it in the associations that are present in the report between reporting highly on Fair Work dimensions and reporting more positively on elements of task and other types of performance. And we've seen it in a lot of evidence that's come through from other sources about what kind of practices that people have engaged in. So if we needed reiteration that high quality people management matters, then this experience of the last year has given us that. I think related to that, my kind of second positive insight is to highlight that many employers have, even during a very difficult period, have seen the benefits of all of the prior or previous investments that they made in relation to Fair Work. Because all of the things that we know go along with Fair Work, engagement, commitment, resilience, resourcefulness, being creative, showing your initiative, going the extra mile, all of those things have been real assets as businesses have had to turn their business model around or deal with unprecedented demand or lack of demand or work in entirely new situations, and doing all of that while supporting colleagues facing very new and very distinctive challenges. So I think that has shown the benefits of Fair Work in a crisis. I think the third point, which is very positive, and Marek used the term sticky in his presentation, it's important to highlight how sticky or embedded good practice is. So in my day job at the University of Strathclyde, our research team produced the UK Good Work Index report for CIPD, and we were really interested to do that because it was fascinating to know what would happen over a year in which the world changed really dramatically. And we were perhaps a little surprised, as many people might have been, to find that there was so little change. But the more you think about that, the more you think about the data and the context, the more sense the findings make. Because fair work and good quality jobs are well embedded in what organisations do. They're well embedded in their policies and their processes and their practices, and they will have served businesses and other employers well in the past. So it was really unlikely those were going to get stripped away at a time of huge challenge. In actual fact, some of those practices were kind of supercharged in a sense to drive the responsiveness that employers needed to continue to function. So there are some really interesting positive implications for fair work out of the data that Marek's just reported on. But there are some things that are of course more concerning, and I'll make a couple of points about that before finishing. If I can return to that point about stickiness, good practice is very sticky and well embedded, so is poor practice. And so are jobs that don't deliver fair work, they're also sticky and embedded. And the data in the report tells us that persistent, long-standing inequalities in access to fair work have either continued or some of them have actually been exacerbated over the last 15 months. So when we put out our Conventions Fair Work in Scotland 2020 report, which was based on data before the pandemic, we highlighted some of the inequalities which Marek's presentation have shown stubbornly persist. So your chances of accessing fair work are influenced in various different ways by your occupation. And we know that occupation is a close proxy for class. Your chances of fair work are influenced by the industry you work in or by personal or demographic characteristics. And none of those inequalities have gone away. And indeed, some of them have worsened somewhat. I think our second concern relates to two groups of workers that Marek highlighted. So we know, given the data collection period for the CIPD survey, that it doesn't capture the experience of people who are not employees, and it won't have captured some of the people who were displaced between March 2020 and early 2021. So the people who were not still in employment at the time when the data was collected. And it may be that that's a distinct group whose experiences have worsened considerably. So I think we as a convention need to think about how we understand the experience of that group. And the second group is, of course, furloughed workers. We know that we're really in something of a pause when it comes to people who have been furloughed because we just don't know what will happen. once furlough is over in September. And as Marek showed, workers on furlough show quite distinctive responses, even though while they have been furloughed, most or all of their income and their employment has been protected. So I think we need to be very mindful of what happens to that group in the future. And I suppose my last concern reflects what Marek says around key workers. We know that we've had a lot of conversation about key or critical workers over the last year. We know that that's a really broad group, broad category of workers. So it goes from frontline health and social care staff to people in transport or retail or food production or infrastructure. But what that group shares is all were designated as being critical to the COVID response and the continued functioning of society and the economy. And as Marek said, we clapped them rather a lot for doing that. But the indicators that they report are far less positive around job design, having resources available, having autonomy to do their job, having work-life balance or access to flexible work, and less positive around psychological safety and mental and physical health. Although more positive, as Marek points out, in terms of the issues around seeing a sense of purpose in their work. We don't know, of course, what they would have reported last year had critical workers been identified in the survey. So we don't know how much changed for that group, particularly over the year. But we do need to be concerned about some of the issues that have been highlighted there. The people who have been critical to keeping going during COVID haven't had the same access to fair work in the past, or indeed, arguably in the past, or indeed during the last year. Just want to say one last thing. I haven't mentioned home working as a positive or a negative, and I think for the reasons that Marek outlined, it doesn't quite fit easily into those categories because it's been a bit of both. So home working has been hugely important in terms of a public health response to keeping people safe. It's kept businesses open, it's kept people in work and continuing to earn, but it's been a massively mixed bag of experiences for those who've worked at home. So we've had people who can't work at home and people who can, and often that's a bias toward higher level knowledge workers. So we shouldn't, when we talk about fair work in Scotland, lose sight of who could and who couldn't work from home. We know that there's something of a crude but real distinction around the idea of an emerging COVID elite. You know, people who can work from home, have good space, equipment, facilities, can continue to earn. Some of those people have improved their work-life balance, but others either can't work from home or are working from home in much more challenging circumstances. We know in CIPD has talked a lot about, and the convention's talked a lot about, the massive variations relating to sex, childcare and other caring responsibilities. And some of those have been really immediate about how people balanced all of the things they were doing, homeschooling, working from home, engaging in care responsibilities. But I'd like to finish off just on some sort of longer term issues arising from homework that I think have big implications for fair work and something we should keep an eye on. Because it's not just the question of who will be able to work from home, who will want to work from home and who will have that facility available to them. It's not just the issue around the challenges for employers and employees in making either home working or more hybrid arrangements work. But I think there's some really important long-term issues which have implications for fair work that will emerge out of that. So if we think about how home working might impact on things that were already problematic, say women's career development, home working might give an opportunity to improve some aspects of work-life balance for working women, but it might actually create some negative outcomes around career development, because we know women can be much less visible even when they're physically in workplaces. So we're sitting at a cusp when we need to think about how some of these practices which have emerged during the pandemic might have longer term implications in both directions for fair work. So just to finish, lots of positives in the report, which is great. Some issues of concern, which I think employers need to be very mindful of, that CIPD and HR professionals will certainly be dealing with over the coming period. And as a convention, we will continue to monitor in the months and the years to come, hopefully continuing to be assisted in this in the future by data sources like the Working Life Survey, which have been very helpful to us, and hopefully as part of an ongoing dialogue and discussion with CIPD and its members. Thank you.
Tricia, thank you so much. That was excellent and very, very interesting. I'm pretty sure that listeners to this will appreciate your thank you and your call out to the HR profession. I think there's plenty for us all to be proud of, and it was a running theme of our conference earlier as well. So very much appreciated. Francis, I'll come to you now to provide a sort of real world practitioner experience of navigating what must have been the most exciting but also frustrating and busy 15 months of your career, I would assume. And if you have any sort of suggestions of what might change longer term, I think the attendees would be very interested in hearing that. We have a couple of questions in already, but I will encourage everybody again, please pop them in and we'll get through as many as we can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Patricia. As you were both talking, I was scribbling down all sorts of notes, the kind of things you were prompting me on in changing the way I've reflected on the kind of last 15 months in that as well. I thought if I tried to do almost a bit of a look back and then a look ahead of what we've tried to do, and particularly think about how there's areas that I think potentially would support Fair Work, and then it also makes me think there's some that challenge it really. I think one of the first things that's really critical for us at Virgin Money is we're a purpose-driven organisation. Our purpose is making you happier about money. And the way we describe that is making is about taking bold action. You is about paying attention to your interests rather than mine. Happier is about creating better emotional outcomes, and about money is about creating better financial outcomes. And we very quickly, as the crisis kind of hit, it was very, very clear that it required bold action. It required paying attention to the needs of our colleagues and our customers. It was, hugely emotional. Sorry, that's a warning battery going there. Huge emotional kind of impact, and clearly, for an awful lot of people, real financial uncertainty. So what that allowed us to do very early on was ground an awful lot of our actions in that purpose. So in some of the early decisions, I think we made that were constructive and quite symbolic. So we were very clear in our terms, store colleagues and contact centre colleagues, anyone in customer service was a key worker, continuing to have to travel and go into workplaces at a time when public transport wasn't happening, potentially the place where they would buy lunch wasn't open, so their cost and access to work was more difficult. So very quickly we committed to covering people's expenses for both kind of food and travel in order to work. We were very clear early on that we wouldn't put people on furlough, so we're trying to give people that kind of clarity. And while we had a number of people who were having to work at home or work to isolate or be at home, we were trying to think how to make use of them. We were also really clear. One of the things I was probably most pleased with our responses early on. We spent a lot of time recognising that there was, in those early phases, there was a huge amount of guidance to people, whether it be government documentation or on the BBC or company information, loads of information. What it didn't give people was personal context or personal meaning. So whether folks were struggling with kids or a house or whatever it may be, there wasn't a lot that gave people the opportunity to find meaning. So what we started really early was sessions for colleagues to basically just talk with other colleagues, and we'd run them on a whole raft of subjects. But it was really that being able to, get people a chance. I'm struggling with the kids. Anybody got any good ideas? Or giving people a chance. They may be fine, but potentially, family members being furloughed or lost role, or the uncertainty that goes around in life was clearly impacting people. And at the same time, we did a lot of work with people leaders. We talked about that and the kind of practice of management there. I would say the last 15 months must be the most acute change in management that there has ever been. We effectively flipped from an environment which was largely you could see your people and you could talk to them, to one where everyone was dispersed. You didn't have the practices that were in place. You didn't know what was going on. You didn't know how best to support people, and you've got your own life challenges. So really, early on, we tried to do a lot of work with people leaders on supporting them on how they would support their people. Over time, there are a number of things in. So there's a bunch of decisions that I think we did really well and supported people really well. But it struck me, and one of the things Patricia kind of called out there on some of the inequality of work. And so there are things where we worked hard to give people, everyone who could, give them the chance to work from home. But there's odd things where we found a number of colleagues who couldn't work from home because the work processes they did ran on Windows 7, and we only had Windows 7 on desktops. So people were stuck having to work in the office, and you can't get Windows 7 laptops anymore. It's that odd points of inequality that only come out with talking to people and engaging with them and really, really listening to them. In respect of listening, I think like all companies, we did lots of the sort of surveys early on, but my view on surveys is in things like that, in a crisis that is very, very individual, the surveys won't get you to that individual circumstance. So, the surveys didn't surface that people who relied on Windows 7 couldn't get home. What we got was a number of people who were dissatisfied with their laptops, and others, the tech team saying, well, there's enough laptops for everyone. So the thing we had to complement that with was lots of doing more focus groups with colleagues to get them talking about what's going on with them. And we run a lot of what we call online jams, so online discussions where questions are posted and anyone can participate, and that flushes out so much more richness. So whether it be family situation, work situation, the technologies are talked about, challenges for trans colleagues or living in multi-generational households, so many things that allowed us to get more tailored in terms of what we do. And then the other piece that I think really helped us through the crisis, I like what Patricia talked about, the stickiness of good practice. So we changed our performance approach in 2017, moved away from an annual approach. At that point, we embedded well-being into performance discussions. So the whole theory being, basically, you can't perform well if you don't have well-being. That's having well-being is the fuel for everything else. It's the expectation that people leader and colleague talk about well-being as the first thing in every quarterly performance discussion. And our aim was to normalise talking about well-being in good times, so that when there are bad times, people are more comfortable talking to their boss about it. We thought that would be individual bad times, if you like, rather than a global challenge. But what it meant was that by 2020, we'd got decent practice in terms of people talking about well-being as part of the performance mechanism. So the conversations were much more normal. So there are things like that I think had really served as well. We also, as part of being a Virgin company, trying to push things at the envelope a little bit. So we, looking at colleagues who are isolating from stores, we knew that's not great for them, that's not great for their well-being. We equally know that people have lots of financial problems and concerns at the moment. So we created something that was called Money on Your Mind, where essentially customers could say, I've got this financial question. Didn't need to be about our products. How could, what's the advice? And so we'd record a number of videos. So it gave both fitted to our purpose, supported our customers, but importantly supported those colleagues and gave them a sense of well-being who otherwise were stuck at home, and in many cases feeling guilty because their colleagues were continuing to go into stores and so on. So we did a number of things like that. We also ran a kind of big purpose fest to create more energy and more excitement, and those things about giving people a kind of sense of engagement. I'd seen a fascinating thing, I think it's in people management actually, where an NHS director talked about, by the time of the second wave, the sort of goodwill that came with the applauding the NHS and so on, had all eroded. Everyone was sort of tired. So we'd talk about giving, ironically, we'd call it shots in the arm for our culture. It's only just dawned on me that shots in the arm is kind of, maybe need to change that. But that doing things that kind of support and sustain people and keep them going is really critical. When I look ahead, and I think that when we talk about hybrid work, I find it really, really interesting where it's almost like for lots of people that because we've been stuck at home, and before we used to spend all the time in the office, it's almost like what people think is, I don't want to be here, I want to be in the office. Their ability to imagine a world that's much more fluid and work takes place in different ways, different times and so on. We found with our colleagues, they found it hard to imagine that. So in the approach we're taking looking ahead, and I know Mark, you and I have talked about this a fair bit, we're really paying attention to mental well-being and sustainable mental well-being. We've looked at things like consequences of other pandemics and the long-term trauma that comes from that, the impact of too much screen time, too much time being sedentary, and all of these things that increase likelihood of depression, anxiety, or other kind of mental conditions. And we can see the intensity of work in this environment is greater than it has been in the past. And again, it's an interesting one. I find it really interesting in that lots of the Fair Work has remained the same. But I suspect we're all feeling more tired in work, or by Friday people are just more frazzled. Or so there's almost like our tolerance is I don't know whether it's increased or decreased just because this is normal for us at the moment. So when we look ahead, for our work approach, again, we're trying to do something a bit different. We try and play on the brand in order to create something different. And so we're talking about creating what we call a life more virgin, i.e. having a life that works for you, is more disruptive, allows you to have better experiences. Our starting off point is looking at work personas. So what is it that your job absolutely requires of you? Broadly, location and time. So if you work in a bank branch, you work in a bank branch. So there's almost like what are the minimum things that are required? But then where we try and go from there is what's the team rhythm? Because I think very often in work we treat it as a really individual thing, but what my teammates, I have a responsibility to my teammates, they have a responsibility to me. So we've tried to look at what are the things that your team require. And then we've very specifically worked with individuals on two things. One is what's your stage, is what we pick up a lot is concerns about onboarding, concerns about career progression, concerns about building networks. So whether that is life stage or career stage, it clearly drives sort of different needs. And then the last bit is about me. So what is it in your life that you want to achieve or you want to work? So whether that be you've got bad broadband, you've got a long commute, you've got care and responsibilities, really trying to bring that in. And we're using a tool called Work Happy, which what it tries to pull out is what is important to you about work. And the reason we're using that is trying to help people think about what is it they want. So where people have said to us, I want to be in the office, we're really trying to test that. And generally what we're finding is, I want to see my friends. Like I used to spend 8 hours with my friends at work. That's what people want, rather than necessarily being in whatever office they were in. So we're trying to use that as a means of looking ahead into getting people working better, but in a way that may be partly at home, maybe partly in office, maybe partly somewhere else, and trying to be much more fluid really in that. But it is tough, and I think the piece on Fair Work, and again what Patricia said, if you've got more space, better technology, more autonomy, your ability to make the most of what I've just described is much greater. And we're having to work much harder in places like stores, contact centres, customer services to give people greater autonomy, greater voice about the way they're working and so on. it's something we're working hard at, but it is definitely more difficult. So, Marek, I should probably stop there because I'm conscious time-wise. We need to give a chance for some questions.
Francis, thank you. That was excellent. Yes, the time seems to have disappeared, and we don't have quite as much time as I thought at the end for questions. But we'll get through them. I'm sure we've got a few that have come in. But if people have any more, then please send them in. Francis, you mentioned well-being quite a few times during your section there. One of the questions that actually has come in on long COVID in particular, and something that we sort of spoke about some time ago as well, in particular long COVID in relation to key workers, and you've got a few of those in Virgin Money. Obviously, key workers necessary to go to work. Maybe they pick up the disease because of having to go to work, and then they suffer from long COVID symptoms. What can be done? How do we keep this in mind? What can employers do, perhaps even governments can do to try and address some of these challenges? That's not an easy question there. The question is actually from Leslie. It's directed at Tricia as to whether this is something that the Federal Convention is doing or is aware of. So perhaps I can open with Tricia, and then Francis can.
I think it's a very good question from Leslie. As a convention, we've really pushed successfully to have work-related ill health as part of one of the indicators in the National Performance Framework for Scotland, because it's important to know whether or not people collectively or aggregate data about whether or not they get ill at work in different proportions in different types of occupation. More individually, clearly there is an issue around how businesses and other organisations will respond to people with long COVID. Clearly, there are big challenges there. It may well be that long COVID will ultimately be considered in the same way as other forms of disability because of its age and if it meets the requirements. But certainly, it's something which is very central to our focus in understanding work-related ill health in a way that's not how we looked at it before. So in the past, we looked at structural injuries from work, musculoskeletal disorders. We've started to be much more open to the stress illnesses that arise from work. And I think we're now going to have to think that we're in a new phase where we need to consider whether or not there's a cohort of staff across the Scottish economy who will be affected by that and respond accordingly. So yes, we are aware that it's an issue because it's very central to what we know about work-related ill health. It's a new version of that. And I think we need much more insight and much more data. But I'm sure Francis will be able to respond much better from an individual employer's point of view.
Thank you, Tricia.
Yeah, I have to admit, Patricia, I was very glad when Marek said the question was for you, because it's really hard. And if you want to say, I don't think we haven't updated, for example, any of our health policies or anything like that to reflect long COVID. But it's something I will definitely take away to look at. I think because it is a really interesting thing. As you say, there's lots of things that work creates an illness, and then something like this where by being at work, I can't think of another circumstance where being at work would then lead you to catch something that has such a long-term effect. So there's probably very little I can add, but it's definitely one I'm going to take back and pick up with my colleagues.
Excellent. One question that has come in focusing specifically on young people and young people's chances to access fair employment after the pandemic. That's a very pertinent question, considering things like the Young Persons Guarantee in Scotland as well. Francis, Tricia, any thoughts on that? Francis, I'll start with you this time for a change. Young people, is there anything specific that you do at Virgin Money?
We're trying to. We've taken a really good look at where in the past we would have run things like graduate schemes. And that sort of classic sort of 2-year graduate scheme moving around a number of roles. We're really changing that, where essentially what we've worked out is for every graduate scheme, we can move about 10 people through apprenticeships. And so we're really trying to move to look at, is there a way where as many of our kind of entry level roles, whether that be entry kind of, immediately from school or post university, that we can turn those into apprenticeships and really make much more kind of structure of that. There's a number of things on that. One, I think it helps people develop. It gives them structure and moves them into the workplace. It'll move them through as a cohort, which I think will be really important. And it also gives them a greater degree of certainty. So certainly in a number of graduate schemes, you join the scheme, but 2 years further on, you're then having to try and find your way into a permanent role. So particularly for young people who've had a huge amount of uncertainty over, what will be 3 academic years, giving them a degree of certainty, I think will be really important. Mm-hmm. So it's something we're working on right now to try and shape, is there a way we can have essentially more cohorts, more structures to meet both the social, the developmental and the career needs of people.
Okay. If I can just say very quickly, the convention's working very closely with the Young People's Guarantee leadership and team, because it becomes even more important that we don't allow the pandemic to produce additional disadvantage for young workers. They were already disadvantaged in a number of different ways, but we can't allow it to produce additional disadvantage. And one of the things we've stressed very heavily in the work that we do with the Young Persons Guarantee team is the importance of young people having a voice, because sometimes they're not a group that's well represented in formal voice structures, or less likely to take part in company level voice structures. And I think that point about using the guarantee and the process behind that to really understand how we give young people a voice as to how the specifics of the situation are affecting them. And we know we all know that from our own organisations. It's not just whether or not you get a job, it's how you're inducted into that job, it's how you find your way around it, it's how you learn from other people, it's how you access mentorships. There's lots of HR problems there. But for us, we've really focused as a convention on this issue of voice. We need to find ways in which young people have an effective voice to be able to shape the response to the challenges that they face in a distinctive way.
Excellent. Well, that was good to hear that you're closely involved with the guarantee. We've been doing quite a lot more work with the guarantee as well at the CIPD level, and more to come. We've just run out of time, but I'll ask the very last question, because the first one that came in, and it's quite an interesting one, which is, if you had one wish that John Swinney as Cabinet Secretary for COVID recovery or Richard Lougheed as Minister for Just Transition, Employment and Fair Work could grant, what would it be? This is very much a public policy question. And I'll go first as well, to give you about 30 seconds to think about the answer. For me, it would be to take a lot more of a strategic approach to upskilling and retraining, because the gap is still there and it's a persistent gap. And we need to consider these things not just as a result of the post-COVID recovery, but in terms of a sort of longer-term Industry 4.0 related skills development system. So that would be mine.
Okay, I'm going to rather cheekily have kind of 1.5 answers. So my first answer is keep up a commitment to fair work. We know that it's been beneficial. We know that it can produce better outcomes as we try and get out this difficult period. And in that, learn from what worked. So learn at a policy level about the structures that emerged during COVID between employers, unions, policymakers, other interested parties, which actually allowed people to plan a route map through some of this. Learn from that. Learn from how voice in workplaces has actually made a real difference. Understand that better and find ways of delivering policy that can support that and encourage it.
Thank you. Francis?
And I think I would be quite close to where you are, Mark. I think as an employer, one of the things that's really hard is connecting various, so like Young Persons Guarantee, the apprenticeship levy and other sorts. It just becomes difficult. When we're a large employer, smaller employees won't have the resource to be able to piece those things together. So being able to find a simple route through to support employers, to support people to build skills would be hugely helpful.
Yeah, simplifying the landscape and improving the signposting. It comes up at every employee roundtable that we run. Okay, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up there. We overran a little bit. I'm sorry to the participants, but I hope this was interesting. Tricia, Francis, thank you very much for taking the time. I hope you enjoy your lunch, and hope everybody listening in enjoys their lunch as well.